Sorry about that. Okay, well, thanks everyone for taking that poll. We'll screenshot it and it helps us keep a little track of what's going on with our audience. It is interesting to us that we usually have as many local and state government as we do nonprofits, which we love. Okay, so the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, if you haven't encountered us before, we're a national initiative, mostly volunteer driven, but it's a sort of a co-hosted project by NeighborWorks America and the National Community Stabilization Trust. We're focused on mobilizing attention to reverse the disappearance of middle neighborhoods through decline or gentrification, which is happening quite a bit. And I bet that Alan and Todd will talk about that today. I think the most basic way of saying it is that it has been our observation that because middle neighborhoods aren't the most distressed in a community, that people tend not to think about them, either philanthropy, local government, nonprofits. It just isn't where anyone tracks what's happening. So we're trying to get people to start doing that and intervening where necessary to keep middle neighborhoods as really wonderful mixed income places for people to live in cities. We have a community practice. We do research. We have policy analysis and advocacy topics, and a lot of communication strategies. We're just about to really launch our LinkedIn account, so please try and follow us at LinkedIn. And so what's a middle neighborhood? We don't have hard and fast metrics, but they tend to be neighborhoods that were built mostly with single family homes for families with children. They tend to be still well more than 50% owner occupied, but that may be slowly eroding. And probably they were had much higher rates of owner occupancy initially. The housing stock is aging. It seems still to be in generally acceptable condition, but it often lacks features and updates that would help it compete well for today's home buyers, unless, of course, we're in a pandemic housing market and people are a lot less picky about those features. One of the most interesting things about middle neighborhoods to me is that they tend to be more racially, ethnically, and economically diverse than either their lower income or higher income counterparts. I think that they are those those sort of mixed income neighborhoods that so many of us in community development try to maintain or create as a way to provide great housing and neighborhood opportunities for a variety of people. Just want to draw your attention quickly at our website to a mapping tool we have that kind of allows you to toggle between some income ranges to see what census tracts light up in your MSA. And we have a couple of time periods and a few different income ranges, but you'll see that they tend to be around 80 to 120, as you might expect. So our panelists today are here to talk about some of the key lessons in their new book, The Changing American Neighborhood, The Meaning of Place in the 21st Century. And we have the co-authors today, Alan Malik, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Community Progress and a real friend to middle neighborhoods, and Todd Swanstrom, who's the Desley Professor of Community Collaboration and Public Policy Administration, and the Graduate Director of Political Science at University of Missouri in St. Louis. So the topics that they'll talk about today include why neighborhoods matter, the forces that drive change in neighborhoods, specifically middle neighborhoods, and how to think strategically about managing your neighborhood through those changes. And then we'll have time at the end for Q&A, but please do type in your questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we may even be able to answer some of them along the way. We're going to keep this kind of conversational too. So there may be times when Alan and Todd will just, pose a question to the group, and you can type in answers in the chat. Sometimes we may actually have you on mute, but it's pretty informal. So let's enjoy this conversation with the two of them. Welcome, Alan and Todd, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
So is Alan starting?
No,
Well,
Todd is
No,
actually going to
Todd is
start.
starting.
I'm
Okay.
I'm gonna start. Well, Marcia, thank you so much for the invitation for Ellen and I to talk about our book and talk about neighborhoods, which we love to talk about. So, you know, the middle neighborhoods movement is so important because moving the dialogue upstream to the things that preserve neighborhoods that are already strong instead of waiting for the reinforcing processes of a decline to set in. It's much more difficult to revive a declining neighborhood than to preserve a strong neighborhood. So it's kind of a public health approach. It's so important. I'm so glad we can be here to talk with you. I'm going to begin by talking about a broad theme of the book, it kind of overlays the book. There's a certain nostalgia for the tight-knit urban neighborhoods, often ethnic neighborhoods that existed, were very common a generation ago and still exist here and there. The kind of neighborhood that was depicted in Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you know, where you sit on the front stoop and chat with your neighborhoods. And as Cheers says, everybody knows your name, right? That kind of place. I grew up in one of those neighborhoods in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was the Denoyer Park neighborhood, which is in the midway area of St. Paul on the Mississippi River, not too far from the University of Minnesota. Just about 6 months ago, I walked my street again, and I was shocked to realize that I knew dozens and dozens of names of people who lived in the houses. Now, a lot of them have moved on, of course, but when I grew up there, I knew their names. I had a paper route, right? We would play Simon Says on the front lawns. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and she spent a lot of time in the neighborhood, you know, the neighborhood sort of busybodies, and they would plan things. They planned the annual winter carnival at Denoyer Park School, which had Strauss waltzes and all these games and everything. So it was a good neighborhood to grow up in, right? It was that old style, tight neighborhood where everybody knew your name. Now, these urban, tight-knit neighborhoods are largely, Alan and I argue, a thing of the past. Tight-knit communities where people sit on their front porches, smoozing with their neighbors are rare today, killed off by air conditioning, handheld devices, the internet, among many other things. We no longer spend that kind of intense neighborliness that existed in previous generations. As good as they were, these tight-knit neighborhoods had great limitations, so we shouldn't romanticize them, right? They were highly gendered and racialized. For example, in the Denoyer Park neighborhood I just spoke about, I don't remember a single Black family in the entire neighborhood, right? That was just the way it was. I never even thought about it, frankly. The civil rights movement has really created a different situation, even with regard to racial segregation, which is down 30% between 1970 and 2020. Obviously, racial segregation still exists, still a problem, but not nearly as intense as it was in the 50s. Women have entered the workforce. Between 1960 and 2020, the percentage of households composed of married couples with children fell from 40% to 19%. Women have entered the workforce. They can't be the glue that really holds together these tight relationships in these urban neighborhoods. The decline of tight-knit neighborly relations, however, does not mean that neighborhoods are not important anymore. And that's the theme of the book, that there are neighborhoods that have what we call weak ties. Even though neighborly relations are less intense today, the Changing American Neighborhood argues that the physical and social spaces created by neighborhoods matter more than ever, ironically enough, right? Even though they're weak ties, for the health and well-being of 21st century Americans. The weak ties that are nurtured in modern neighborhoods help bridge the social divides that plague our society and reduce social isolation. So what do I mean by weak ties? What are weak ties? They're simply the casual, cooler relationships we have in encountering people in neighborhoods. We don't necessarily know the name of the person that we're interacting with. We don't invite them into our house to have dinner. We don't invite them to the bar mitzvahs or the baptisms, right? But we encounter them. We know them at some level. You might encounter them while they're walking their dog, and you might pet the dog or something like that. Maybe it's just a nod of recognition down the street, or maybe it's just our favorite barista at the local coffee shop who you nod to and she says the usual, right? Or he says the usual. So weak ties are what Robert Putnam called bridging social capital as opposed to bonding social capital. Bridging social capital is that capital that goes across social divisions of race, religion, You can imagine economic class and all these different divisions in our society. So bridging social capital is in many ways just as important, if not more important, than bonding social capital. It helps you to get ahead at the same time that it helps you to get along. We are not saying that people don't have close friends in neighborhoods, right? That's not the point. Sure, you might have some very close friends who live close by, but these weak or casual ties are the essence of the modern neighborhood, and we underappreciate them often. We don't recognize how important they are and how valuable they are. The weak ties are nurtured in certain kinds of places. That is to say, weak ties are engendered in places where it is relatively dense. That is to say, there's a certain population density with a mix of land uses, like retail and residential mixed in somewhat, and public spaces where people encounter one another in their daily rounds. Now, suburban areas that are low density, single-use communities that are completely reliant on the automobile, they might have their own form of community, they might have their own form of ties, but it's not going to be the kind of weak ties that we're talking about in modern urban neighborhoods. In these more auto-dependent suburban locations, and of course it's a gradation here, right? No neighborhood is a perfect weak-tied neighborhood. Nobody's a completely sprawled out neighborhood. But in these more low-density, single-use suburban jurisdictions, you choose who you interact with, right? It's not based upon some serendipitous random encounter in a public space. So you're going to curate your social ties more closely that way. Weak ties are based on serendipitous or unplanned encounters in public spaces. So what are the benefits of weak ties? I've said they're very important. Alan and I argue that they are perhaps more important than ever. The original literature on weak ties made the point that they help people to get ahead. Job networks. If you know people just a little bit across different social connections, right, that will give you information perhaps about it. You'll hear about something, right? And the research is clear that weak ties are very valuable for finding jobs and finding opportunities. Weak ties also help people to get along. In other words, if you have this kind of casual or cooler tie with people, that can really bridge social divides. You might not invite them to dinner once again, but you develop a certain degree of tolerance or respect in public spaces that is very valuable, obviously, in our society, which has become so polarized around certain identities. Weak ties also tend to overcome social isolation and a sense of loneliness. The Surgeon General a while back stated that loneliness is an epidemic in the United States. It's as serious a problem as smoking for people's health. And I read now a kind of a whole group of social psychological studies about the importance of weak ties. And one study had people carry clickers around all day long. And every time they had a weak tie encounter, they clicked the red clicker. And every time they had a strong tie, they clicked the black clicker. A strong tie meant that there was somebody they knew well, somebody in their family, somebody whose name they knew, as opposed to a weak tie. And what they found out is that strong ties are connected to an index of happiness, of well-being, and they're also connected to social connection, overcoming loneliness. But weak ties, independently of strong ties, are also strongly correlated with a sense of happiness and a sense of social connection. So weak ties overcome that. And finally, I'm going to state that weak ties are very valuable to help neighborhoods to defend themselves. Strong ties can actually be a problem to the extent that you have cliques in the neighborhoods. You have certain ethnic or family-based networks that are very intense that can divide the neighborhood. The weak ties provide this bridging social capital across the various elements of the neighborhood that create a kind of pool of trust that can be mobilized very quickly if the neighborhood is suddenly threatened. The original study about weak ties talked about the South End in Boston and how it had been difficult for them to oppose urban renewal because it was a very ethnically embedded, set of strong social ties. So let's turn, Alan, can you share figure 1 at this point? And I will talk a little bit about that. And Alan's going to really fill you in much more detail. Okay, there we go. So the first thing I want to say is, and Alan and I stress this in our book, that neighborhoods are always changing. You cannot stop neighborhood change for the most part, except maybe in the most elite neighborhood, and maybe the very, very poorest neighborhood, but most neighborhoods are changing all the time. You cannot stop change. You need to work with the forces of change, acknowledging the limits of what you can do and the influences that shape your opportunities, right, to guide the neighborhood. Here we see figure 1, exogenous factors and endogenous factors. Those are kind of fancy words. They basically mean external factors from outside the neighborhood that are impacting the neighborhood versus the characteristics of the neighborhood itself that in some cases you have more control over here. So people have many choices on where to live, right? They can choose to live anywhere in the metropolitan area if they have an automobile for the most part. So the market for your neighborhood is shaped by these exogenous and endogenous factors, and you need to understand them. Context matters. Every neighborhood has a different context. So that's what we're trying to stress here. There is no cookie cutter solution to reviving neighborhoods. There's no cookie cutter strategy for neighborhoods. So just very quickly, if you look at the left-hand column, migration, well, how much immigration is there in your metropolitan area? Are there a lot of new households coming into the region? Is that going to create a tight housing market? Is that going to drive housing demand? What about competing sources of housing? Do you have a kind of suburban sprawl machine that's generating lots of new housing on the urban fringe? Here in St. Louis, decade after decade, we have built more housing units than there are new households in the region. As a result, automatically, you're going to have weak market neighborhoods where the housing supply is going to exceed the demand. And so you have to take that into account. It's going to be very difficult to revive these large swaths of weak market neighborhoods in North City and County in St. Louis. The job and business growth, what we talking about, is there an eds and meds economy? That's the new source of dynamism. We're no longer the industrial city, right? We've had this economic transition to the knowledge economy, whatever you want to call it, these eds and meds. Where are you located relative to where these jobs are? These jobs are often concentrated in clusters or corridors, right? And what is your relationship to the growing job base? Taking a look at the endogenous factors very quickly, your housing supply, what kind of housing do you have? Single family, multifamily? Is it architecturally significant? Is it historical? Neighborhood amenities, parks, retail outlets, public spaces, libraries. Do you have these kind of amenities? Can you leverage them? I often think about middle neighborhoods as places that have under-leveraged assets, right? Can you leverage those assets? And finally, neighborhood stability. As we talk about in the book, nothing succeeds like success. If you're a stable neighborhood, you'll tend to be a stable neighborhood in the future. If the neighborhood has undergone a lot of change, that's a challenge, right? And you're going to have to be very intentional about addressing that. So with that quick overview of this idea of weak ties and just a quick comment on the neighborhoods as systems, let me turn it over to Alan to go deeper into how these internal and external factors interact to produce neighborhood change and how we can think strategically about how to preserve middle neighborhoods. Take it away, Alan.
Thanks, Todd. That's a great intro. Okay, so before I turn to the different factors and show you a new graphic, just one thing to stress, it is really important to understand all of the different factors that are shown on this chart. You know, if you're trying to change a neighborhood, you really need to know what factors are affecting your ability to do so, what things give you opportunities, what things create challenges for you. And that's kind of a starting point, even before you start to get into the real nitty-gritty of trying to make neighborhood change. Understand your environment, know your territory. And next slide. Okay, now this one may look like a real bear. It actually makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to walk you through it. And at the end, you're going to say, piece of cake. Now I understand neighborhood change. Okay, basically, you know, there's a maybe kind of an assumption that a lot of people have is the way you change neighborhoods is you do something. You build a park, you build a new housing development, you create a job training program, you do whatever, and then the neighborhood changes. And once the neighborhood changes, it continues to go in a particular direction. Okay, not so. Okay, and this is what we're trying to show here. Basically, whenever you make any kind of change to the neighborhood, or some change happens from the outside, because that's the other thing. You as a community development professional are trying to change the neighborhood, and you're doing certain things, but at the same time, lots of other things are happening that can be changing the neighborhood. So this is the point. When something happens, it doesn't just have a simple X happens, Y results. It's a chain reaction, you might say, of different impacts, which in turn all come together to determine what happens to the neighborhood. And what we've shown here is, and the first thing to know, two things. First, any intervention, any change initially affects people's perceptions, and then it affects their behavior. It doesn't affect their behavior directly, which means that how the change is presented, how people think about it, is as important as the substance of the change. And there was a great example. Somebody studied a neighborhood in Boston. This goes back maybe 10, 15 years, where the nonprofit was trying to rehab a whole bunch of derelict houses. And to their surprise, the people in the neighborhood, this was a kind of a working class middle neighborhood, the people in the neighborhood were at best indifferent and even hostile. And the nonprofit why on earth are people giving us such a hard time about wanting to rehab a bunch of houses? And so this researcher went out and interviewed a whole lot of people and said, and it turned out that somehow people in the neighborhood had come to think that these houses would be entirely, as they say, Section 8 housing. And in this working class, solid but still threatened neighborhood, that was seen as a real negative, as something that would really undermine the neighborhood. So they were against it. So that's the thing. Perceptions are critical. Number two, there are a lot of different actors involved in shaping a neighborhood. Now, in this chart, we show 4 basic groups of actors. First, you have the people who live in the neighborhood. How do they feel about what's going on? How do they feel about the future of their neighborhood? How does that affect what they do, whether it's improving their houses, whether it's sticking around versus moving, whether it's getting involved versus drawing themselves into their shell? Secondly, you've got the government, the local government. How do they see the neighborhood, and how does it fit into their thinking? And then what are they going to do? Are they going to provide funding? Are they going to take funding away? Are they going to close the school? Are they going to rehab the school, and so forth? Then you have a whole bunch of institutions, banks, lenders, foundations, employers, businesses, who are constantly making decisions that indirectly or directly affect neighborhoods. And then finally, you have the larger market, all of the people in the community, in the region really, who are looking for housing to buy, to rent, and so forth. So all of these people have different ways of looking at the neighborhood, but are constantly affected by what they think is happening in the neighborhood, how they understand what's going on. And how they think of the neighborhood, how they understand what's going on, determines how they behave, in whether they make that investment in their home, or the government makes that investment in that school, or people choose to buy or not, and so forth. So you've got to see it in this multifaceted way. And then the other thing, and this is a little complicated, but it's really important. Neighborhood change is not a straightforward linear path where things are constantly interacting with each other, and they form what we call in our book feedback loops. How government behaves in a particular situation is going to influence how the residents feel about the neighborhood. That's going to, if the school board decides to close the school in the neighborhood, and that affects the residents' feelings about whether the neighborhood is going up or down or what, then affects their behavior. If people start neglecting their houses and they start looking not too good, shabby, peeling paint, slightly tilting porch, dirt front yard, and so forth, then people who might have thought to buy in that neighborhood might say, nah, it doesn't look quite right, and go somewhere else. And so everything is constantly in a feedback system. And that's really important as you think about how you're going to change a neighborhood and how you can change a neighborhood. It's not a simple, I'm going to do this and the neighborhood is going to change. Even though this may seem complicated, it's really important to have all of these pieces in mind as you're thinking about it. Now, I like to, as we go along from here, if people can put their reactions to this, what I've just been saying, as well as to what Todd said about weak ties earlier, be very interested to see how does this resonate with you? Does this connect? Do you see this as being useful? So if you can put your thoughts about this in the chat box over the next few minutes, we're going to go on talking because that's what we do and there's only so much time. But we'll come back and respond to some of the things that you say. But so start doing that while you're listening with your ears, sort of multitask. Okay. Then I'm going to segue into something slightly different. But once you've got this general way of thinking in mind, what do you do with it? Okay. The first thing is to start looking at your neighborhood. This is where you want to say, okay, I understand how this works, and I understand that I need to have some kind of a strategy, because if I'm going to keep all these pieces together and I'm going to try to really make change happen, I really have to have a strategy. I can't just wing it. And so the question is, what does that mean? So I'd like to suggest starting with a thought experiment. Namely, ask yourself, and this is tricky because you've got to be as objective as you are humanly capable of being. Where do you expect your city and your neighborhood to be? Demographically, economically, etc., 5 to 10 years from now. Not where do you want it to be, not what do you want from it. Looking at it objectively, looking at the strengths and the weaknesses and the assets and the challenges and so forth, both in your city and region, but especially in your neighborhood. Where do you expect it to be? Now, one thing is, do you expect your neighborhood to gentrify? Now, that's a tricky question. One thing I've found is I've gone around, talked to people in different neighborhoods and different cities around the States. I find there's a kind of, you might call it gentrophobia. There is a fear that your neighborhood is going to gentrify that is pervasive. Now, looking at it from the outside, I can say, no guarantees, but I can say with fair amount of likelihood, this neighborhood has a serious likelihood of gentrifying. This neighborhood doesn't. But that's not something that a lot of people grasp, that gentrification is not inevitable. In any given day, month, year, more neighborhoods are not gentrifying than gentrifying. In many cities, more neighborhoods have actually gone downhill than gentrified. Secondly, there are some factors you can actually look at in terms of the location of the neighborhood, the housing stock, the racial and ethnic makeup of the neighborhood, that, again, even though there are no guarantees, can help you predict the likelihood of gentrification. So I think this is where you have to sort of try to put your preconceived notions aside and look at your neighborhood as dispassionately as if you were a visitor from Mars, and ask yourself, where do you think this neighborhood is going in the next 5 years? What are the problems that are getting worse? What are the things that are getting better, and so forth? Because that's a really important starting point for then saying, okay, the next big question is, what do you do about it? And I'd just like to respond. I don't know, Todd, if you're looking at the chat, but the comment from Kimberly Faison, because I think that is really a key point there. It wasn't the ties within the family that disintegrated. It was the weak ties, basically, that sort of kept the neighborhood glued together. And a neighborhood can have, and this is something that's, I think, really important. You could live in a neighborhood and be part of a very intense sort of kinship network of your immediate family, your grandparents, your cousins, what have you. And that can be very supportive. But at the same time, the neighborhood itself can be very threatening, even dangerous, if you don't have those weak ties bridging the various close kinship and family and friendship neighbor relationships that exist. So if those get lost, that can be devastating to the fate of a neighborhood. So going on, the next step is starting to think strategically. And there are a couple of key points here. I think the first thing is, what do you want to happen? Now that you understand what is likely to happen if nothing changes, and again, remember Todd's point, neighborhoods always or almost always change. It's like a river. You can't step in the same river twice, they say. You can't step in the same neighborhood twice. So where do you want it to be in 5, 10 years? And then what is your narrative, if you will? This is, human beings, I don't know who first said it, but pretty much everybody said it. Human beings are storytelling animals. They want to have a story about whatever, about themselves, about their family, about their neighborhood. And part of trying to bring about neighborhood change is trying to tell a story and trying to figure out what your story is. Now, clearly, a story that doesn't have any relationship to reality isn't going to be a very good story. People are going to see through it. You might fool them for a while, but not for long. So the story has to be real. If the neighborhood has problems, you've got to acknowledge it. But what you're trying to do is convey how it can change, how your work and all the work of everybody else in that neighborhood can make it change. And so the first thing is, where do you want to go? Where do you want your neighborhood to be? And again, think of it holistically. It's not just about fixing houses. Again, it's about perception. It's about as much, if not more, as this, about the spaces in between the houses and about how people use them and relate to them. One thing, this is a small thing, just mentioned. I live in a tiny village. Which is the kind of place where if you go for a walk and you see anybody, even if you don't know them, you say hi. And if they're walking the dog, as Todd mentioned, you stop and pet the dog. But mainly you say hi. If it's somebody you know, you might stop for a chat. Well, one of the things, this is something I've done and I recommend when anybody wants to take the temperature of a neighborhood, if you will. Go there and just walk around. First, if you don't see anybody, if it's on a nice day, if you don't see anybody in the streets and on the sidewalks, then that's a sign in itself. But when you see people, smile at them or say hi. See how they react. Some people are going to be a little taken aback. But if they feel good about their neighborhood, they're happy to be outside in the neighborhood, they'll probably respond. If they don't, then they'll give you the fisheye. So, but that, again, these things make a huge difference. So think about the neighborhood as a whole. And then I'd say the next thing is start putting together a plan. And here, one thing, and this is a kind of a fallacy, I think this is a community development fallacy, that a neighborhood plan is basically a design and land use document that's got lovely pictures about what the neighborhood is going to look like after we've done this, put up this house and rehab this house and planted trees along here and so forth. Now that has its uses, but to me, a neighborhood plan is something very different, even though it might include some of that. It's about some key questions. First, what are your goals? What needs to happen to get there? Who needs to be involved to make that happen? And what resources are needed to make that happen? I think those are kind of the four kind of key steps in framing a neighborhood plan. And again, building new houses may be part of it, but I would say by definition, it cannot be all of it. It's got to be a lot of other stuff. How do you get people involved? How do you get them engaged? How do you help them improve their lives? After all, most of the people in the neighborhood already live in a house or an apartment. They're not, the people who live in the neighborhood are not your market for the new houses. They have a place. How are you going to change their lives for the better? Make them feel the neighborhood is stronger. So, and then of course, what resources are needed? Now I'm going to come back to that because that's sort of the last point we're going to get to, which is critical. But I'm going to turn it back to Todd to talk about a particular example of a neighborhood where a strategy worked, might put it that way.
Thank you, Alan. I'm going to talk about the Fox Park neighborhood in St. Louis. And of course, I won't do justice to this example because it's much more nuanced and complex in a few minutes. But it's a really interesting case. And as Eric said in the chat, everyone defines gentrification differently. Well, here we'll see an example of a particular form of gentrification, right? And I think it's interesting that there are, the indigenous tribes in Alaska have 50 words for economically ascending neighborhoods, but we only have one word for snow, but we only have one word for economically ascending neighborhoods, and that's gentrification. So there's more nuance here. The Fox Park neighborhood is located in St. Louis, just south of the Central Corridor, in the heart of the south side. So it's pretty close to where the Eds and Meds economy has boomed over the last 30 years. It has brick frame housing stock. St. Louis is famous for our wonderful brick. We have this wonderful, I don't know what you'd call it, burnt umber brick that was produced here locally. So we have this historic, rather architecturally significant housing stock in Fox Park. 2/3 of it is multifamily, mostly in 2 to 4 unit buildings, very small duplexes, fourplexes, that were beginning to look very dilapidated back in the 70s and the 80s. Fox Park declined. This is a common story, right? In the period of the urban crisis, you had a lot of neighborhoods that suffered a lot of disinvestment, dilapidation, drug houses, high rates of crime, and a poor reputation. So one of the things that Fox Park had that a lot of neighborhoods don't have is a high capacity CDC. There's one executive director there, Tom Pickle, who was executive director of DeSales Housing Corporation for, I think, 28 years, which is, he got to know the neighborhood pretty well. He's a very competent manager. And they came up with this strategy for building the market, which was to address the derelict multifamily properties which were generating a negative image for the area. By acquiring abandoned rental properties and rehabilitating, this took over decades, we're talking over a 15 to 20 year period. By purchasing these properties and rehabilitating them using funds obtained through the sale of low-income housing tax credits to ensure long-term affordability, DeSales saw an opportunity to pursue an intentional strategy to simultaneously improve living conditions for tenants who are often living in very deteriorated, dangerous conditions, and improve the visible appeal of the neighborhood, making it more attractive ultimately to potential home buyers, right? The home buyer segment of the community. But they were successful in acquiring a large number of LIHTC projects. Now, not every neighborhood can do this because there's only so many LIHTC, grant applications that are successful, and they're extremely demanding, as a number of you probably on this call know. Just to produce this grant application successfully and get it through the gauntlet is difficult. They also, of course, acquired the management fees from this. So there's kind of a feedback effect, as Alan talked about, right? You succeed in getting the LIHTC grant, that gives you some of those management fees to increase the capacity of your staff and your organization to pursue other projects in the future. So it's kind of a virtuous circle, if you will, in this case. They also created something called Foxgrove Management Corporation, which managed the rental units. They needed to get to scale to do scattered site rental management in an efficient and effective way. They manage over 1,500 units in the city as a whole. So this is a highly competent rental management company that is a nonprofit management company. So the strategy of rehabilitating the rental housing stock seemed to work. Fox Park basically gentrified. If we mean by gentrification, the increasing number of young professionals choosing to live in the neighborhood and often buy and fix up single-family homes. So the percentage of adults 25 to 34 with a bachelor's degree or higher increased over 400% between 2000 and 2014. So after the turn of the century, there was a big movement of professionals, higher income professionals. Between 2000 and 2017, median home values increased by about $42,000 in inflation-adjusted terms. That's not a huge increase, but that's not what had existed before this, right? This was single-family homes were going up in market value. And the final point, which is really interesting, is there is little evidence of direct displacement from this gentrification. There was an movement, as I say, of young professionals from the knowledge economy. But between 2000 and 2017, median rent in the neighborhood went up $33, once again adjusted for inflation, which is significantly less than the citywide increase in rents, which was $80, right? So you have a neighborhood that was gentrifying and rents went up slower than the city as a whole. Well, how could this possibly happen? Obviously, we don't know for sure what was going on, but certainly part of the story, we think, is that DeSales owns over 240 units of rental housing. So you have a social housing sector in this neighborhood that's rather significant for this rather small neighborhood that could moderate the rents. So what we have in this case is what we think is gentrification without displacement, but there was gentrification with replacement, right? Replacement, not displacement. That is to say, when units turned over, often you had young educated professionals moving in, right? So the Black population in the neighborhood did decline, but given the fact that the rents were not becoming exorbitant in this neighborhood, it's probably not that they were pushed out by rising rents, but they chose to move elsewhere, right? And different people replaced them. That theme, once again, the neighborhoods are always changing. So you have an example here of a neighborhood that gentrified in a certain sense of the word gentrification, right? If you went there, by the way, if you're from Boston or New York, you wouldn't think this was a classic gentrified neighborhood. It has a few cool coffee shops and restaurants and things, but it's not Georgetown, right? But it has succeeded, and as Candace said, in her example, you can gentrify, and then you can turn the other direction, right? It can go the other direction. So now the neighborhood needs to maintain this condition, right, after coming back from a difficult situation. So that's the story of Fox Park in a nutshell, as we see it, and it's successful example of a successful strategy, working through trying to clean up, if you will, the rental housing stock, which had a negative impact on the image of the community, which then enabled and attracted home buyers to come in to fix up the single family homes, which are largely row houses in the neighborhood. So let me turn it back to you, Alan.
Mute, yeah, there we go. And again, I think in a way, Fox Park was able to get the best of both worlds because they had an infusion of investment in both building a stronger market and creating a way to preserve affordability for a significant part of the residents in the community. And really, you need for a neighborhood to be most successful, you need that combination. If you don't have a functioning market where people are willing to put in their own money to buy houses, fix up houses, and so forth, the neighborhood is going to struggle. If you don't have enough affordability, the neighborhood is going to struggle. So it's a sadly relatively rare example, but an important one of how it's possible to combine both. So,
Alan, can I pop in with a question? Which is, one of the things we haven't been explicit about is what would happen if we didn't do anything to these neighborhoods and so I'm sort of curious what you guys think nowadays about how inevitable would it be if nobody, and I realize there's never a situation where nobody's doing anything with regard to a neighborhood because of all those forces. But, it used to be the idea is that filtering, that a neighborhood would get older and older and older, and it would have less and less value, and it would become more and more affordable. And then, people would move further out and further out. And I think part of what we're trying to do is interrupt that process so that those neighborhoods, so decline isn't the only option. Is that even a situation that you think still holds true? Is that what would happen to most neighborhoods if no one were paying attention to them?
I don't know. Well, I don't know about most, but a lot. A lot depends on the larger housing market picture in the city and the region. So in in a legacy city like St. Louis or Detroit or Cleveland, where you don't have huge overall demand, it's still, I think, a very real risk for a lot of neighborhoods, especially if you have a middle neighborhood with older frame houses, say, and people are leaving it and not being replaced, and you start to see vacancies happen. That neighborhood can easily continue to decline to the point where at some point the number of vacancies gets to a point, and I've been calling this hyper vacancy, and I'm pleased to see that people are starting to pick up on the term. I should get royalties, but that's the way it goes. That at some point, if you have too much vacancy in the neighborhood, basically it's like it acts as a huge brake on the housing market. At that point, people basically, certainly home buyers, stop buying, even investors, except for the sleazier group of bottom fishers, stop buying. And that's when a neighborhood may get to the point where it's beyond repair. Maybe, I don't want to think that any neighborhood is totally beyond repair, but at some point that can happen. But in a place like, let's say, Washington, D.C., I don't think that's ever going to happen, because the overall demand for housing and the price pressures in the region are just so powerful.
Let me just comment quickly, Marcia, because you mentioned filtering theory. We discussed filtering theory in the book. And filtering theory sort of has this image of almost a benign, smooth process whereby housing filters down as people move outward to the suburbs, leaving behind their older housing for the next group of people slightly lower on the economic ladder than them. And all of this is quite positive because it gives people more housing less expensively. Well, the filtering process is not so smooth and so benign. As Alan and I are involved in a project now, we're trying to get the issue of housing deterioration and disinvestment more on the policy and political agenda. And what's happened is, in the United States, our basic strategy for affordable housing is to allow older housing to decline, and it has to deteriorate to a certain point, and so it becomes affordable, right? You don't invest in. So there's a real kind of negative process through. But also, just quickly to say, Marcia, there are two forces going on simultaneous. We say it's sort of a layering of historical forces. You continue to have the outward movement or the deurbanization as we decentralize our metropolitan areas. But we're also having re-centralization. That's the whole gentrification conversation. So you have two simultaneous forces occurring. So they're clearly, and those forces vary in strength. Washington, D.C. is different than St. Louis, right? St. Louis is different than Youngstown. So there's different degrees of forces. And therefore, it's not inevitable. It certainly is not inevitable that neighborhoods will filter down and get to the end of the filtering chain and be torn down, and we have urban renewal, right? It's always going to be much more variable than that. There are these counter forces, and there's a lot of complexity. So a city like St. Louis, it has the Sun Belt and its suburban boom, and it also has a bit of Georgetown and the Central City revival in it at the same time. And both of those forces are operating. And you need to understand how these simultaneous forces are at work in your metropolitan area.
Absolutely. Suburban sprawl ain't over. And the notion that there's been this reversal and now everybody wants to move back to the city is basically, it's a fantasy. And part of the problem is that when you look at a lot of the cities, especially, again, I'm looking at legacy cities, the cities of the Midwest and so forth, not the hot cities like New York or DC. Basically, there are two groups of people moving into cities. Immigrants, to varying degrees. Some cities, that's virtually nothing. In other cities, it's quite significant. And young, college-educated single people and couples. And they have very specific housing interests or abilities, and they don't necessarily always correspond to what a particular neighborhood is looking for. But families with children, older people, and so forth, for the most part, are still net moving out. And one thing that's particularly significant is that today, the families and older people who are moving out of the cities are as or more likely to be Black as white. So that's important to bear in mind. So just to wrap up, I want to sort of just finish up the basic theme about strategy, what have you, because the problem is, and I realize this, and I'm sure all of you realize it as I was talking about strategy, is there are never enough resources to do everything you want to do in a neighborhood, or everything that your plan says ought to happen in the neighborhood. So the question is, you have to choose. and how do you choose? Now, again, every neighborhood is different and the specific choices are going to be different. But there are two things you should think of. First, the more you if your neighborhood is unstable or declining or at risk, so forth, the more you understand and really analyze what the factors are that are making it unstable or at risk, the more you'll be able to understand which interventions, which projects, which investments are more likely to make a difference. And just one example is this goes back, Baltimore, starting around 2010, developed a really impressive strategy for getting vacant, boarded up row houses into the hands of developers, contractors who fixed them up and put them back to use. And after they've done it for about 6-7 years, I was asked to do an evaluation of their program. And one of the things that I looked at, the number of vacant boarded row houses in 2010, the number they rehabbed, the number in 2017, and so forth. And I discovered a very interesting thing. In a bunch of neighborhoods, they rehabbed, say, 80% of the row houses that were empty in 2010. And the number of vacants went down by 70 or 80%. In another neighborhood, they rehabbed 80% of the row houses that were empty in 2010, and the number of vacants went up by 20%. Well, there's a reason. In the first group of neighborhoods, it was the vacant properties that were the drivers of decline. The neighborhood wanted to be stronger, it wanted to improve, it had the assets that people wanted to live there and so forth, but the vacant properties were blocking it. So once they rehab those properties, change could happen. And new vacancies stopped popping up. In the second neighborhood, the vacant properties weren't a cause of anything. They were a symptom of other problems. And because all you were doing was masking a symptom, you weren't changing the trajectory of that neighborhood. And so as you fixed up a house, somebody down the block walked away from a house. You fixed up another house, somebody walked away. So the key thing, understand what's driving the problems that you're trying to fix.
Well, what was driving the vacant properties in that example?
You know, lots of things. It was certain big problem is that obviously people with money, people with enough money to afford to become a homeowner. I'm not talking about rich people by any means, but just middle class families were no longer, they didn't see those neighborhoods as worth it. There were underlying issues. There could have been issues of crime. There were a lot of, in some of these neighborhoods, there were the perception was, I don't know, I didn't get into it deeply enough to know whether this was true, but the perception was that these neighborhoods had heavy drug activity and that a lot of middle-class families didn't want to buy. There were school issues. There were, so there were a lot of underlying issues having to do with the basic, you might call, social texture of the neighborhood that were keeping people from investing their own. So the first thing is plan your options based on your understanding of what's driving the problems, rather than, and this is a constant risk, is not on the basis of necessarily the funding that you can get at any given moment. The second thing is start to build what I and Marcia and others call a theory of change. Now that sounds very, I don't know, complicated, intellectual. Theory of change is not. Theory of change basically boils down to, if you want to, let's say you want to build a you're trying to change the neighborhood for the better, and you have an opportunity to get a grant to rehab a bunch of houses. The theory of change is, and again, this is important to be as objective as you possibly can, is to ask yourself, why do I think, given my analysis of what the problems of the neighborhood are, why do I think rehabbing those houses is going to have an effect on the dynamic of neighborhood change for my neighbor? Now, if you can answer that question in a way that doesn't just satisfy you, but can satisfy other people, then it might make sense. If you can't answer that question in a way that is compelling, then you don't have a theory of change. So it's basically having a compelling reason to believe that you can articulate and convince other people and make part of the story that if I do X, I'm going to get the results that I want to see in the neighborhood. And that is critically important. And if you don't have that, then odds are, as I don't know if it was Yogi Berra or who said, if you don't know where you're going, you're going to get there.
Well, and the danger is that depending on what your long-term place-based outcome is, it may be that a different strategy presents greater opportunity to get to that outcome.
Exactly.
One of the things that I think this is very, very common in our field for a long time now is there's lots of money around for creating, new home buyers and new home ownership opportunities and all of that. It's much more difficult to do the strategy that Todd talked about, scattered site rental, which has, in my experience, of course, every market's different, but wow, does it have an impact? But it's one of the hardest strategies to do. It's very difficult, and it's difficult to keep the funding going. Yeah, and it's not as popular, but I think that to me is one of the reasons why a theory of change is so important, is to keep focused on what's the long-term outcome, and are we really moving the needle toward those outcomes? It may be that the strategy we're doing is not hurting anything. And I've had plenty of people say to me, well, it can't hurt to do, rehab 5 houses, but it does take away from an opportunity to do something else, possibly.
Yeah,
Well,
that's the thing.
I was going to
Can I make one?
Go ahead, Alan. Go ahead.
Okay, quick point. Everything you do carries with it an opportunity cost of what you're not doing. That's a fundamental principle of life that we tend to forget about in the excitement of doing something. So that's always important to bear in mind.
I was just going to say, Marcia, that I think we have been so enamored of home ownership, and home ownership is obviously important. The research is pretty clear that homeowners are more engaged, in the civic life of the neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. However, renters are extremely important. Some people at certain stages in their life, they move a lot. They can't own a home. They're moving, and they are part of our society. They're important. The other thing I think is so interesting is that renters are much less sensitive to racial diversity as a negative, right? They're much more open to it, because if all your assets are wrapped up in your home, you can become very sensitive to the racial dynamics, where you might think, even if you're not a racist, right? You might think, well, society's racist, and if I invest in a home in a certain type of neighborhood, I'm not going to. But renters are much more willing to live in more diverse areas. So renters are part of a vanguard of racial diversity and these weak ties that we've been talking about. So they are crucial. They're not just the tail of the dog. They can be the dog itself. So it's important to, I think, recognize how important rental housing is. And you're so right, Marcia, that politically it's so easy to support, repair funds for older homeowners in St. Louis. But when you talk about landlords, which is really important, it's much more politically difficult, right, to support them, even though a lot of these small mom and pop landlords need as much help as any homeowner, right? They're not necessarily You know, slumlords, they're just dealing with a difficult situation. They don't have the tools, they don't have the skills, they don't have the capacity to address the issues of rental housing stock. So we
And they
need to
may
do a lot
be,
more. Yeah.
they may be a key, when people are trying to make sure that as other things about the neighborhood improve, that there isn't displacement. A lot of people in the neighborhood are renters, and if you can't control the quality and price of rental housing or influence it in some way, it's going to be hard to manage that change, I would think. But
Very
carry on.
much so. Yeah, let me just on that point, I thought this was a great example. Some years ago, I was asked by a foundation to come to a particular city, which I won't mention the name of, and answer the question, or help at least. They had been investing a lot of money in a neighborhood strategy around 2 or 3 key neighborhoods. And after 8 or 9 years, they felt that basically they hadn't moved the needle, and they were planning to cut off the funding. And I forget, somebody suggested, well, before you do that, why don't you try to figure out why it didn't work? So why? I don't know. Anyhow, so I went down there and I looked around and I talked to people and I did a lot of number crunching and so forth. And I said, in the final analysis, look, you had developed a strategy that was entirely based on working with homeowners, improving the quality of life of homeowners, encouraging homeowners in a neighborhood where 60 to 70% of the families who lived in the neighborhood were renters, and a lot of them living in substandard conditions. How could you expect to change a neighborhood if you've basically ignored 2/3 of its people and 2/3 of its housing stock? End of story. So I think this is a great opportunity to see if there are any questions. There's some great comments in the chat.
Well,
I'll
could
just
I
say
ask?
quickly to John
I-
that there is an organization in St. Louis that Tower Grove CDC runs, partly through a grant from the city, to train landlords in screening, train landlords in maintenance, and all these issues. And so it really is so there is a possibility to Google Tower Grove CDC and their landlord training program.
Mhm. I was going to just toss out to both of you, is there anything that you can say that you think applies specifically to middle neighborhoods, since that's our audience today, what you see and what you think are the major forces that affect them one way or the other, and what the challenge is?
Well,
And why perhaps my title is true, that every middle neighborhood needs a strategy to thrive.
okay. I'll say a lot of the middle neighborhoods I've looked at, and by the way, just FYI, there are a couple of things I've written about middle neighborhoods that really drill down into that question that Marcia just asked far more than I possibly can. And I comment here, and we can get you the links to those. But the middle neighborhoods, and I would say especially Black middle neighborhoods, are suffering from a whole series of sort of layers of, I call them shocks to the system. And I think first you've got an aging out of homeowners, but tied with that, they're not being replaced by homeowners. Younger families don't see these neighborhoods in many cases as attractive. They're going to the suburbs. Houses are bought by investors. Houses start to get into disrepair and are sometimes abandoned. A lot of the older houses have huge deferred maintenance problems that drive people, even if they want to live in the neighborhood, they may not buy because they can't find a house that they can actually just move into, which is what most normal people want to do. You have issues of, again, many do have issues of safety and public services, education. In some cases, it can be even as simple as street lighting, the condition of a park, the condition of the streets. People notice all of these things and they matter. But so the key thing is that these neighborhoods are still viable neighborhoods, but they're under a huge pressure. And I think one key piece is that you want to figure out how to rebuild the homeownership market. And whether I think there are a lot of different things you can do. Marketing might help, but again, it goes back to, if you don't have a good story and you're trying to sell smoke and mirrors, it's not going to work. So there's no perfect mix percentage. My gut feeling is, if you're looking at a neighborhood where the great majority of the stock is single family houses, you want it to be over half homeowners. Should it be 60%, 70%, 57.6? I don't know. I don't think it matters that much. But I think you want to have a neighborhood, and this may sound a little fuzzy, but nonetheless, I think it's important, where homeowners set the tone. And I did a study, just a quick and dirty thing, some years ago in one city. And I was able to combine some data on the condition of properties, the condition of absentee-owned properties, and match it against the homeownership rate in the neighborhood. And what I found was amazing. The higher the homeownership rate, the better the quality of the landlord-owned properties, by a huge margin.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, the better the quality of the owner-occupied properties as well. But the difference, the slope of the curve, if you will, for the landlord property is much, much steeper. If the landlord owned a property in a place which was not 80, 90% absentee, they basically didn't give a shit. They were out there to make some bucks and walk, in all likelihood. If they owned a property in a neighborhood that was 70 or 80% homeowner, they maintained that property at a very high level. So it's important to have the homeownership set the tone. But whether it's, again, 60 or 70 or 55%, it's hard to tell. And again, it's important to work with the landlords and make sure that they are maintaining their properties.
Just a quick comment, Marcia, in terms of middle neighborhoods. As we emphasized in our fancy graph there, right, graphic, perceptions matter tremendously, right? That outside forces do not automatically impact the neighborhood. They impact it through the perceptions of the people who live in that neighborhood. They have to sell the neighborhood at some level, right? It's ultimately sold by the people who live there. So when I've talked to folks in St. Louis, sometimes you get together with people who, and there's this important approach, which is the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and we're pointing out our problems. We've got our streetlights are out and they're yelling, and this is good. We got to do this. We're going to yell against the city and get them to come to fix the streetlights, get them to address the crime issue. They've been breaking into cars in our neighborhood. But if you're going to construct a narrative for your neighborhood that's going to be able to lift up your neighborhood, you've got to focus on the positives. So there's a bit of a tension there, right? Of course, you should be advocating and pointing out the problems in your neighborhood and going to the city and telling them they need to address these problems. But that's very different than generating a positive narrative. I think we quite Michael Schubert in our book to the effect that, revitalizing neighborhoods is as much about constructing narratives as it is about constructing housing, right? You've got to construct a narrative that's compelling. And I think Alan and I would agree, you can't construct this narrative out of whole cloth. Don't make it up. You got to have objective conditions. But I find that in St. Louis neighborhoods, people hide their light under a bushel. That there are all these little tucked away places. And I think it's true of other cities as well, that that we are not lifting up and celebrating the way we should, because people are craving for these kinds of convivial neighborhoods. I don't know about you, but I just sometimes just go and do work in a coffee shop. I like being with other people. I like having those third places like that. So anyway, I think it's important to construct a narrative and and to focus on positives at the same time that you are aware of your negatives, right? And you are trying to address problems. But if that's all you talk about at the neighborhood meeting is the problems, that's what people are going to hear.
Okay. Yeah, I like,
Amen. I've spent many years blasting that from classes on neighborhood branding.
well,
There's
you were-
another, oh,
yeah,
well, go ahead and finish that, but I'd love for us to also address the question that Eric put in the
yes,
chat.
I was planning to.
Okay,
That was where
Go
I was
ahead.
going. I'm on my way, coming. Okay, the answer is now you can't keep somebody from buying a house. You can't pass an ordinance that says unless you live within 50 miles of the city of Cleveland or Detroit or whatever, you're not allowed to buy property in it. I mean, that's you. So what you have to do is figure out a way, if this is going to happen, how do you manage it successfully? The first thing is, and I think a lot of cities, I see there's a comment about Cleveland local legislation. A lot of cities and towns require first that landlords register, which is critically important. And when they register, if they live outside, usually it's outside the county or outside the state, they must provide the name, address, and full contact information of somebody within the county or city who can accept legal service, who can act on behalf of the owner, and who can address emergencies. That's a minimum starting point, I think. And every city should have some kind of ordinance like that. Secondly, you have to have effective code enforcement. Third, I would say you have to, if there's gonna be a landlord with a major presence in your neighborhood or your city, no matter where they're based, you have to figure out a way to establish a line of communication with that entity and try as best. Now, no guarantees, any of this stuff, but try as best as possible. And this works a lot better if you have the city government, the right ordinances in place and so forth. Say, look, it's sort of welcome to the city of X. We're glad you invested in property here, but we've got standards and we've got rules, and we're going to hold you accountable. We like good landlords who are good stewards of their property. We do not like landlords who let things go. But I think that you've got to create the climate, and it starts with having the right ordinances and the right city policies, but that's not enough. You've got to then go that extra step and establish lines of communication. And along those lines, I would say anybody who is working in a neighborhood which has any significant amount of rental housing should make a point of getting to know, sitting down and talking with, getting to understand the concerns of the landlords in that community. There's a lot of feeling in urban neighborhoods that landlords are the enemy. And hey, some are, but a lot of them aren't. And even if you're not on the same page with the landlords in many respects, you still have to talk to them, because going back to that model of neighborhood change, they're actors in that space. Their perceptions and their behavior are going to affect anything that you're doing. So you'd better get to know them and try to establish working relationships with them. And then, as Todd mentioned, try to develop, whether it's programs, activities, and things that can support what they're trying to do, because most of them, in my experience at least, are not evil. Only a few.
Yeah, one of the phenomenon that shapes this is that we're getting a lot of scatter site rental single family homes in inner ring suburbs of St. Louis County. These are post-World War II, relatively small as 800 square feet, maybe up to 1,200 or 1,400 square feet. These are homes which, it could be great starter homes and really are affordable housing, but they're owned by these absentee landlords and they're scattered, right? So And frankly, that's always going to be a challenge to maintain them, right? I mean, they're not in one place, they're not, and so Beyond Housing, which is a NeighborWorks affiliate here, the NeighborWorks affiliate here in St. Louis, owns hundreds, I think it's upwards of 400 or 500 scatter
Yeah.
site single family homes that they have often rehabilitated, and they have the scale, right? They have on staff people who know how to fix, keep things up, and they work with people in providing them the services they need to apply for the earned income tax credit or whatever it might be to. So there's I think ultimately we need that's a version that this has taken, the scatter site single family rental, which is a real challenge. And I think people, it's going to stick around, right? People need to rent a place, and it's relatively affordable, but it needs to be done in such a way that these can be maintained. And for the most part, absentee owners, I don't think do a great job, because they would need to have, a whole network of people to maintain these properties, and often they just farm it out to some company that doesn't really feel engaged. I don't know enough about this to say in detail.
This is an important issue, because to be successful at managing scattered site, small rental properties, single family, two family, and so forth, you got to be either one of two things. Either you got to live in the same neighborhood and have your eye on it constantly, and that's true of some landlords, or you've got to have an efficient management operation, high quality management operation. And that requires scale, because it's only if you have a significant inventory, and usually it's like 400, 500 properties is what you're really looking for. Can you then set up the computer systems to track everything, buy in bulk, maintain a couple of vehicles, and have maybe one or two people full-time on staff as just handymen and repair people going around, and so forth. And that's what you need to do quality management. And one thing I would love to see, and I've been arguing this for years and years and years, is to see more nonprofits get into that space. Beyond Housing is fabulous, but they are one of a tiny, tiny number. Now, there are some cities, and interestingly, Las Vegas, I was very much struck, was one where you have a collection of highly competent professional property management firms that will take all of the individual mom and pops holdings, put them into a package, and then create a single, very good management operation. But a lot of cities don't even have that at the for-profit level. So this is a really important thing to be thinking about. And if you're thinking this is something, again, in any one neighborhood, you typically don't have the critical mass. But suppose you got all of the CDCs and nonprofit housing people in the city or region together and say, let's each of us put a little seed money into it and create an organization that we will own. We'll call it the Community Property Management Corporation of St. Louis or Cleveland or whatever. And then help, all of us will make sure that our inventory and any inventory from private landlords that we can convince to go into it will become part of that portfolio. I think there's a viable business model there. Not an easy one, but a viable
that's fascinating one. Ithaca Neighborhood Housing Services in Ithaca, New York has always been in the scattered site rental business. And I lived there for many years during that time, and I really feel like they utterly and completely saved whole neighborhoods, because they just controlled enough of that stock that, the prevailing standard of care had a floor, Unfortunately, we need to draw things to a close. We have up here the code. Oh, and 09B card. Okay, we'll see about that. We'll also put that information in a follow-up email to everyone. This is a discount code for Alan and Todd's book, The Changing American Neighborhood. We're also going to give away one of these books through a random drawing from anyone who completes our evaluation that will pop up when we close this webinar. So you'll want to enter that. We are going to be doing a webinar. Our next one coming up is new market tax credits, particularly because it seems for practitioners I've talked to have exponentially increased the capital they have to work with when they're doing primarily new housing for home ownership. But I understand a few people are able to use it for rehabbing existing housing as well. So we'll find out more about that. On April 17th, we have one of our engagement chats. If you ever want to know more about that, contact Ann DePetta. And I want to really thank everybody for attending today, and especially for Alan and Todd to somehow manage to give us a little thin slice of what's going on in their book. I hope everyone will want to read more about it. And if there's anything in particular that you guys, our audience, would like to see Alan and Todd come back and talk about in more depth, please say so in your evaluation. That we get a lot of our ideas for webinars from what you say in those things. So thanks again, Alan and Todd. It was great having you, and I hope we have you again soon. And good luck with your book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. That was wonderful.